I've been on KDE Plasma 6 since around the launch, so at this point, a good couple of months. So it seems like as good a time as any to talk about my final thoughts and whether or not I think the swap was a good idea, what I learned, and things like that. Now, visually, I've left Plasma 6 in a mostly stock state. It's not completely stock. There are a few notable exceptions. I don't, and I know they were exciting when they were added, I don't like floating panels. I've never liked floating panels. I'm never going to like floating panels, and you can't make me like floating panels. That is the first thing I disabled. I like my bars being on the bottom and preferably touching the edges of the screen. It's just the way I've always done it. It's not going to change. Also, my panel is a tad bit smaller than it is by default. Generally, I like having fairly small panels. Now, when it comes to extensions, I don't really run many, and the main reason for that is I don't want to be tied to them. If an API changes and an extension is now broken and I need that for my workflow, I just don't want to be in that situation. That doesn't mean I don't run any though. So I talked about this one recently, but in my window decorations, these are not the default decorations. The default is Breeze, and Breeze is totally fine. But I really, really like having a colored border. It makes it very easy to see which window actually has focus. It's just something I like from a tiler, and especially if I am messing around with tiling stuff, that's very nice to have. Also, it changes the buttons up here to not be the default ones from Breeze, which personally I just don't really like. I like the more Windows-like buttons here. Classy is incredibly customizable. If you want to use the Breeze icons and you still want to have the borders, that is an option. If you don't want to use your accent color, that is also an option. All of this is very, very configurable. One much less configurable one I still really enjoy is the minimal desktop indicator. I don't like the way that Plasma does it by default. I just want to have a simple list. That is all. Preferably, I would do this with numbers. The only reason I don't use the numbers here is I don't particularly like the way the padding works. So dots are perfectly fine for my use case, and I'm gonna stick with it. Just in case anybody wants to use them, I'll leave both the extensions in the description down below. Now, about the way that I use Plasma, most people would probably assume, considering I come from a tiling background, that I'm going to go and use KDE's tiling editor. Tiling in air quotes. And if you've seen my video on the tiling editor, on the tiling system, you'd probably know why I don't. As a TLDR though, I think it is a very interesting baseline for a system. So if I make this window, I drag it, hold shift, I can put it into either of these tiles. I'm going to call it window snapping because frankly, that's what it is. I think if there was more here, this could be really useful. The problem that I have is this is the only way to interact with it. What I want is some way to use hotkeys to interact with the system, or even just having window rules, so when I spawn a window, it is automatically in one of these tiles that I go and make. By not having that there, it makes the system completely useless to me. On the topic of window rules, I've never been one to really heavily use them. Right now, I've got 2 of them. Usually I'd have Thunderbird as a rule as well, but I just forgot to set that one up. Basically, Discord spawns on my second monitor, and MPV just starts on my main monitor in full screen. That is all I do. But when I do want to make a new rule, it is so convenient to be able to go and click this button, click on a window, get the thing that I want to match on, and then put the window exactly where I want it to be. So I want it to be like this size, and I want it to be here, for example. Then I detect the properties, I get the location, I get the size as well, I can apply it, I remove the window, I spawn it. It's done. That's all I need to do. No fiddling around with any like weird config format and trying to guess where I want a window to be. This is so convenient for doing window rules. And I really wish that some window managers had a tool to automatically generate things like this. Now, you can't go and detect every single property. Some of them you need to go and manually add the property, set it to what you want it to be, and that's fine, because the main things I do with window rules are positioning. And even if the only thing this did was let me click the window to know how to match the window, that by itself would be good enough. Now, going back to the window snapping editor, window snapping, not through the tiling editor, but the window snapping system, which are two different systems, is something that I didn't know how I would go with, because I come from, again, a tiling background where I spawn a window, it's automatically in a tile. I didn't know if this would be good enough, and it's not good enough, but it is certainly enough to make sure that I don't go insane, because when I'm not using the snapping, what often ends up happening, because I just don't want to deal with floating windows, is I just spawn windows like this and then just swap between them, and I often lose track of windows because I'm not going to drag the window around and put it where I want it to be. That's like, it's a giant waste of time. Why would I want to do that? So having the snapping there, at least as something I can deal with, isn't perfect, but it's something. Now, I could do tiling in Plasma. I did videos on both Polonium and Cronkite, and Cronkite, much better than Polonium, are both reasonable approximations of a tiling window manager. Polonium has a bunch of weird issues like breaking maximize. It had a number of crashes that I don't know how to replicate, and crashes I don't know how to replicate are a lot scarier than ones that I do, especially when they're still relatively common. Cronkite did have a number of crashes during testing, but the tiling it did was almost perfect. I can get away with using the master stack layout, but the crashes are just a problem. I don't want my desktop crashing. Moving on from that, a system that I really like is the widget system. Now, most of the time when you're using widgets, it's going to be in your panel. Each of these little things is a widget in here. But I really like having the option of doing things like putting a clock right here, and then putting a clock on all of my other screens as well, because sometimes I have my main screen covered, and I can't see the clock, but I still want to see one. So there's one over here, and there's one over there, and there's clocks all around me. And yes, I could probably put the entire panel on those other desktops as well, but why would I want to put an entire panel on those desktops when the only thing I want from the panel is the clock? There's no reason to. So just put the clock exactly where I want it to be, and because it's not in the panel, I can make the clock much bigger and not have to deal with this giant panel that is now taking up tons of real estate on the screen. One thing that kind of bothers me is I don't have a perfect setting to hide the panel. So right now, I've got it set to the option called Dodge Windows, which basically does what it says. If I put a window behind it, it will dodge the window. By default, I believe it's set to auto always visible. I think it's always visible, which is always visible. Auto hide, I don't particularly like. This is going to make it hidden unless you move the cursor down to the bottom. And then the last one is windows go below. This one I especially don't like because you can have parts of the window cut off by the panel. What I would like is basically dodge windows, but only for full screen. So if things aren't full screen, if I put a window behind this, it will stay there. It will only hide if I do this. At least from my experience, this is the way that most tilers end up working. It's probably not something that most people really care about because it's a very, very minor thing, but I'm very particular about how my panel functions. Another thing I am very particular about is the way that my workspaces function, and I have not gotten used to the way that KDE does it. I still like the way that every tiler does it, where each of your monitors has independent workspaces. So if I go to workspace 2 on monitor 1, the only desktop that changes is monitor 1's desktop. In Plasma, all of them change at the exact same time. I get why it's like this. There's a lot of legacy baggage behind why it's developed like this, and it's going to be difficult to change, and I understand that. But for my workflow, it just makes things more annoying. There are a lot of cases where I want to have windows stay visible when I swap to another desktop, and Plasma has a way to do this. You have to make the window sticky. So effectively what I'm doing is making my secondary monitors have basically static windows, which effectively creates a static workspace, and then even though they are still technically swapping in the background, it only looks like the main one is swapping. This is the way I've been handling streams, and like, it works, right? But sometimes I do want to have the ability to swap to a second workspace, even though I have these screens here that I want to be visible in all other situations. There's probably a way that I can script it to take all the windows on my secondary monitor, turn them sticky, and then turn them off sticky whenever I need to do so, because manually doing that swap is it's just annoying. Now, there's a few things I'm surprised that I liked as much as I did. I, again, from a tiling background, am used to having all of my configuration done in config files. And you know what? I still like it being done in config files. It's nice, and I know you can technically go and modify the Plasma config files directly, but they're kind of like a wonky INI format that merges a lot of nonsense together that probably should be in separate files. But having a GUI to easily go and configure things, honestly, it is kind of nice. Like, I get it, right? I get the value in a GUI configuration. It's really easy to go and find something if you just forget how it's done. Like, if I want to go and change the global theme, I just search global theme, and it's right here. I don't need to go and look at some wiki to work out where it is. Most of the time, unless it's some, like, weird, obscure setting, it's going to be pretty easy to find. And this is especially good for shortcuts because, look, some window managers have wonky as hell configuration formats for shortcuts, and here, I can just add a new one. I can bind it to an application or bind it to a script. I can go and use this as a reference sheet of the bindings. If I want to go and find something like all the bindings related to Cronkite, boom, right there, all of them. Very easy to find. I can make sure I don't have any doubled up bindings, because if you try to make a doubled up binding, it's going to say, hey, stupid, you have a doubled up binding. Do you want to replace it, or are you being dumb? Now, most of my window manager experience was on things like i3, BSPWM, Awesome WM, Sway. These are desktops which are very lacking in the animation department. You can do animations in the X11 ones if you use a compositor, but most of the time people are just using the compositor to do blur. But on Plasma, we have animations for making a window full screen. We have animations for spawning a window and removing a window, for going between desktops. And I did use Hyperland before this, so I'm used to having animations here as an option, but I didn't really care about having them, and now having used them for a lot longer, look, I could go back to a desktop that doesn't have animations. They're not needed to be there, but there is something about having animations on a lot of the actions you do. I don't have one for that one. I think I might have disabled that one, but animations on most of the things you do that really do bring a desktop together and make it a more cohesive experience. And for any of the animations you don't like, or maybe you want to go and see if there's an alternative version of the animation, these can be messed around with in the desktop effects. So if you just want to get rid of everything, I'm pretty sure you can go and disable pretty much everything. The only issue I have with the desktop effects is, firstly, this bit here should have a heading, because this is a dialogue button in a list of checkboxes, which is not at all how this works. These do act like dialogue buttons, but it's very confusing UX to not have a heading there. Also, some of the effects in here, I just don't really know the point of. Like, I get that some of them might be cool, but I don't know why they were made. A great example being thumbnail aside. If I press Meta Control T, it puts a thumbnail in the bottom right corner there. Why? If somebody uses this, tell me. There's also one called Screen Edge, which I don't know if it does anything. It's supposed to highlight a screen edge when you're approaching, and if I move my mouse there, it doesn't do anything. If I drag a window there, it doesn't do anything. I genuinely don't know what that effect is supposed to do. I don't know if I'm missing like an extension or a package to make it work, or what the deal is there. One effect I do heavily use, and it's going to be difficult to go to a desktop that doesn't have it, is desktop zoom. Now, this is an accessibility feature, and it's great for people that need it. It's also great for people making videos that want to go and highlight something that is on the screen. If I want you to look at this little thing right here, I can just zoom right into it. I don't need to do it in post. And you know what? Not having to do things in post makes my life much nicer. Now, there's a couple of things I do with Plasma that might bother some KDE people. I have never really seen a reason to use Crunner. I get that it's here and I can just start typing and I can do things, and that's all nice and all, but here's the thing, right? Like, I have been using D-menu style launchers since I've been on i3, since the very day I started using Linux. And I get that Crunner's there and I get that I can use it, but I have so many scripts built around this system that do exactly the thing that I want to do. I'm not going to change it. I'm probably still going to use this system when I am on Cosmic. I might try out their launcher just a little bit, but like, I'm going to go back to this. And I know it's not as fancy and I get it, right? But it works for me. Another thing is I have never felt the need to install the entire KDE software suite. I don't have SDDM installed. I don't have Dolphin installed. There is a lot of KDE packages that I do not have on my system. And it works fine, right? I've said before that if the KDE developers don't want this to be a legitimate way to use KDE, they should very clearly document it as such and not let distros like Arch Linux have a minimal package. There is also a lot of Plasma I pretend just doesn't exist. I never touch mouse and touchpad configuration or keyboard configuration or game controller configuration or drawing tablet configuration. I have other systems that I use instead of this, and these things, I don't even know what's in here. I think the only time I've ever opened up mouse configuration is, I actually don't know. I legitimately can't think of a time I've opened this screen. This one, I'm sure a lot of KDE people can agree with. I have never felt the need to open up activities. I don't know how these work. I've never bothered to learn how they work. I've never felt the need to learn how they work. And I'm sure they're probably useful to the people that really like activities. But that's not me. I tried messing with activities once, I got very confused, and then I deleted it and just didn't end up going back to it. I'm not saying it's bad. It could be an amazing system that I'm completely missing out on. But at least from what I did, it doesn't seem to be for me. And you know what? After that whole Plasma stuttering issue got dealt with, where most of the desktop effects would cause my entire desktop to lock up, I have had a pretty good experience with Plasma. It's not been a perfect experience. I have seen a number of weird bugs here and there. I did see a couple of crashes, but overall, I get why people like Plasma. I get why people like KDE. There are things I would like to change about it. Most notably is the virtual workspaces. If that was working the way I liked it with individual per monitor, that would be massive for me. And if at a bare minimum, the window snapping interacted with a tiling editor, I probably could see myself continuing to use KDE. I don't hate the experience, but it's certainly not going to be the first thing that I gravitate towards if I have an option. But what do you think? Do you run KDE Plasma? Have you ever used it before? And what do you think about the desktop? I've not used it with NVIDIA, so I can't really comment on that. On AMD, it's AMD. Most things are fine. So, let me know your thoughts down below. So if you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe, /Pay linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and look, maybe I'll come back to Plasma at some point in the future. I kind of want to see what these tiling extensions do.
Something like this.